The Battle of Tours, a significant confrontation fought in 732 AD between Frankish and Burgundian forces under the command of the great Charles Martel and the invading Muslim armies led by Abdul Rahman Al Ghafiqi. This battle is often cited as a pivotal event in European history, as it marked the limit of the rapid Islamic expansion into Western Europe from the Iberian Peninsula. The victory of Charles Martel at Tours is considered crucial for Christian Europe's preservation, ensuring that the region would remain under Christian control and significantly influencing the continent's religious and cultural development. It was a battle that also solidified Martel's reputation as a skilled military leader and laid the groundwork for the Carolingian Empire, which would be established by his descendants. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, it's great to have you with me again. As always, to support the channel, you're already doing it. Just enjoy the content. Those who want to go above and beyond may refer to the video description. And now, without further ado, let us relax, get nice and comfortable, and we can begin our history of the Battle of Tours. The Battle of Tours, occurring after 2 decades of relentless Umayyad conquests in Europe, marked a critical juncture in the history of European continent. These conquests began with the invasion of the Christian Visigothic kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula in 711, and expanded into Frankish territories such as Gaul, territories that were once part of the Roman Empire, now a shadow of its former glory. The Umayyad campaigns aggressively advanced northwards into regions such as Aquitaine and Burgundy, culminating in significant conflicts, including a major battle at Bordeaux and a raid on Autun. Thus, this victory of Charles Martel at Tours is widely heralded for halting this northward progression, effectively safeguarding Western Europe from potential Islamization. Of course, later on they would retake the Iberian Peninsula too, but today we are just talking about the Battle of Tours. Well, historical consensus places the confrontation at the confluence of the rivers Claine and Vienne, situated between Tours and Poitiers. While the exact numbers of combatants remain uncertain, the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, a contemporary Latin source providing a detailed account of the battle, portrays the Frankish forces as numerous and well-armed. In fact, according to this chronicle, the Frankish troops managed to kill the Umayyad leader, Abdul Rahman, aligning with the accounts of many Arab and Muslim historians, who also acknowledge the formidable size and armament of the Frankish army. In contrast to this, however, most Western historical sources estimate the Franks to have been about 30,000 strong, significantly fewer than the Muslim force, which they place at more than double that number. Well, of course, revised assessments by modern historians suggest that the total Umayyad force likely outnumbered the Franks, when we consider the outlying raiding parties that later rejoined the main force before the Battle of Tours. This reevaluation is based on the estimates of what the land could support in terms of logistics, and the number of troops Charles Martel could feasibly raise and sustain during the campaign. The Umayyad forces are often described in various accounts as potentially reaching or perhaps even exceeding 80,000 men, a stark contrast to the estimates of the Frankish forces, which typically range from 15 to 30,000 men. Some historians challenge the higher estimates, however, for both armies as logistically unfeasible, proposing that numbers exceeding 50,000 for the Umayyads and similarly large numbers for the Franks are beyond what the countryside could have realistically supported, given the need for both armies to forage for food locally due to the absence of a formal logistical support system. This view is supported by a consensus that estimates a more likely range for both armies to be between 20 and 30,000 men each. Well, modern historical analysis, leveraging the estimated logistical capacity of the land to support such armies, often presents a more grounded figure than medieval sources. This method suggests that the highest estimates of troop numbers, once thought to be around 60 to at least 400,000, a little ridiculous in my opinion, for the Umayyad side, and up to 75,000 for the Franks, well, they seem to be very much exaggerated. But of course, when you're writing your histories of the time, you want to make the other side look as fearsome as possible, and, well, it's the old parable of the man who caught the very big fish. It gets bigger every time he tells the story. Well, indeed, we can say that the logistical realities of maintaining such a large force on campaign without that sophisticated supply system, well, that certainly just renders those kinds of numbers pretty much impossible. And, well, the battle's losses also remain uncertain, with medieval chroniclers suggesting highly disproportionate casualty numbers, which once more appear to be inflated rather, or reused from earlier battles, such as the Duke Odo the Great's victory at the Battle of Toulouse. These figures were likely conflated over time with those of the battles of Tours, reflecting the era's historiographical practices rather than actual battlefield realities. Moreover, reports indicate that the Umayyad forces were capable of conducting raids in the Limousin region post-battle, suggesting that their army was not as decimated as some accounts claim. There was still plenty of Umayyads wandering around to plunder those little farmhouses. While this further supports the notion that earlier casualty figures may be more reflective of myth rather than fact. But of course, we'll get into all of that a little bit later. But first of all, the Umayyads. Well, I suppose we best introduce the protagonists of the story. The Umayyad dynasty, known in Arabic as Banu Umayya or Al-Umayyawiyun, initiated a formidable expansion of the Sunni Islamic Empire after succeeding the Rashidun caliphs Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. By the time of the Battle of Tours, the Umayyad Caliphate had established itself as arguably the preeminent military power in the world, a reputation bolstered by its vast conquests and the administrative control it wielded over diverse regions and peoples. The Umayyads orchestrated a significant expansion, both to the east and to the west. To the east, their forces surged across Persia, and to the west, they advanced through North Africa along the Mediterranean coast. Their military campaigns were characterized by remarkable victories, including the complete absorption of the Sasanian Empire and substantial conquests from the Byzantine Empire, seizing territories like Syria, Armenia, and territories along the North African coast. But despite all of these successes, their advance was of course eventually curtailed by Leo the Isaurian at the Battle of Akroinon in 740, marking the Umayyads' final military campaign in Anatolia, and a significant turning point that stemmed their expansion into Eastern Europe. And what about the Franks? Well, let's quickly explain who they were. Under the leadership of Charles Martel, the Frankish realm emerged as the preeminent military force in Western Europe. They were the tough guys. That's certainly something we can say. During his tenure as commander-in-chief, the Frankish kingdom encompassed what is now northern and eastern France, including the regions that were known as Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy, as well as most of western Germany and the Low Countries, which, if we put into today's terms, we're talking countries like Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Good luck pointing out Luxembourg on a map. Well, this extensive domain marked the Frankish kingdom's progression towards becoming the first significant imperial power in Western Europe since the decline of the Roman Empire. So it was a big deal, to say the least. Well, despite its growing influence and territorial gains, Charles Martel's realm faced persistent challenges from external forces. These included ongoing conflicts with the Saxons and the Frisians, as well as struggles against other formidable opponents like the Basque Aquitanians. The latter were led by Odo the Great, Duke of Aquitaine and Vasconia, a skilled leader and seasoned warrior who presented a significant obstacle to the Frankish expansion efforts in the region. This dynamic period was characterized by Charles Martel's efforts to solidify and extend Frankish power across a fragmented and often hostile Europe. By 719, under the leadership of Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani, and by the way, I will do my best with the Arabic names, he was the governor of Al-Andalus. Umayyad troops had successfully overrun Septimania, following their extensive conquests up the Iberian Peninsula. Al-Sam established his capital in Narbonne from 720 onwards, a city the Moors referred to as Arbona. With Narbonne's strategic port under their control, the Umayyads faced very little resistance as they subdued the nearby cities of Alet, Béziers, Agde, Lodève, and Nimes, which were still governed by their Visigothic counts. Despite this swift expansion, the Umayyad campaign into Aquitaine encountered a significant setback at the aforementioned Battle of Toulouse. Here, Duke Odo the Great of Aquitaine successfully broke their siege, catching Al-Sam ibn Malik's forces off guard and inflicting mortal wounds on Al-Sam himself. However, this embarrassing defeat did not halt the Umayyad incursions into the former Roman territories in Gaul. The Moorish forces, firmly established in Narbonne and easily supported and resupplied by sea, continued their eastward campaigns into Burgundy, reaching as far as Autun in 725. facing threats from both the advancing Umayyads in the south and the Franks to the north. Duke Odo sought allies, ultimately forming an alliance in 730 with Uthman ibn Naisa, known as Manuza by the Franks, who was the deputy governor of what would later become known as Catalonia. This alliance was cemented by the marriage of Uthman to Odo's daughter, Lampagier, which temporarily halted Moorish raids across the Pyrenees, securing Odo's southern border. But the important word, of course, is temporarily. The fragile peace was, of course, disrupted, as it always is, the following year, when Uthman killed the bishop of Urgell, Nambaudus, and declared independence from his Arab overlords in Cordova. In response, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Rahman sent an expedition to quash Uthman's rebellion, subsequently turning his forces towards Odo, Uthman's ally. Thus, Odo assembled his forces at Bordeaux, but he suffered a crushing defeat. Bordeaux was subsequently plundered, and during the subsequent battle of the river Garonne, the extent of the devastation was such that, according to the Chronicle of 754, God alone knows the number of the slain, which makes me believe it was probably a pretty high number. This chronicler described the Umayyad forces as unstoppable, once again quoting from the text that they pierced through the mountains, trampled over rough and level ground, plundered far into the country of the Franks, and smote all with the sword, insomuch that when Odo came to battle with them at the river Garonne, he fled. Well, this series of events shows the relentless advance of the Umayyad forces, and the dire situation facing the Frankish territories. Somebody had to do something about it. After suffering significant defeats at Bordeaux and Garonne, Odo set about reorganizing his forces and reached out to the Franks for assistance. Understanding the gravity of the threat to his realm, Odo informed the Frankish leader Charles Martel of the impending danger. Charles agreed to help, but only after Odo consented to submit to Frankish authority, effectively recognizing the growing power of the Franks. Well, he didn't really have much of a choice, didn't he? The Umayyads, on the other hand, confident in their military skill, seemed rather unaware of the Frankish strength. Their knowledge of the European powers, including the Franks, was limited at best, and it was only after the Battle of Tours that they even recognized the Franks as a formidable force. Their previous campaigns had not required them to scout extensively to the north, which led them to underestimate Charles Martel, who had been consolidating his power across much of Europe since 717. By 732, the Umayyad forces were advancing north toward the Loire River, moving ahead of their logistical support and dividing into several raiding parties, which allowed the main army to advance more slowly. The delay was strategic, as the Umayyads needed to live off the land, timing their campaign to coincide with the local wheat harvest and its subsequent storage. The tactical situation at Bordeaux and Garonne contrasted sharply with the earlier Battle of Toulouse in 721, where Odo had successfully ambushed an overconfident and unprepared Umayyad force, primarily composed of infantry. According to Hermann of Carinthia's translations, Odo's troops executed a highly effective encircling maneuver, catching the Muslim forces off guard and achieving their decisive victory. However, the dynamics were different at Bordeaux and Garonne. Here, the Umayyad army was predominantly cavalry, fully mobilized and prepared for battle. The Umayyad heavy cavalry quickly overpowered Odo's mainly infantry forces, who lacked heavy cavalry due to the absence of stirrups, a critical disadvantage in combat against cavalry forces. The Umayyad cavalry broke through Odo's lines in their initial charge and decimated the infantry as they fled. As the Umayyad forces continued their destructive path through southern Gaul, they were likely motivated by the riches of the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours, one of the wealthiest and most revered holy sites in Western Europe at the time. Alerted and aware of the danger, Charles Martel began to mobilize his forces. In a strategic move, he decided to avoid the old Roman roads, aiming to surprise the Muslim invaders. As the Umayyad forces advanced towards Tours, they were unexpectedly confronted by a large Frankish force, strategically positioned to block their path. Charles Martel had successfully achieved the element of surprise he sought. Opting for a defensive strategy rather than an aggressive assault, however, he organized his troops into a phalanx-like formation. According to the Arab sources, the Franks formed a large square, using the natural terrain of hills and trees ahead of them to disrupt and weaken the Muslim cavalry charges. For a week, the two armies engaged in only minor skirmishes, with the Umayyads waiting for their reinforcements to arrive in full. Abd Rahman, despite his experience and command acumen, found himself strategically outmaneuvered by Charles, who had not only concentrated his forces effectively, but also chosen the battlefield meticulously to his own advantage. The dense forest helped Charles mask the true size of his army, leaving the Umayyad commander uncertain about the magnitude of Frankish forces. Now, the primary strength of the Franks lay in the infantry. His army, comprised of seasoned and battle-hardened soldiers, many of whom had been fighting under Charles Martel's command since as early as 717. Experience plus loyalty makes a difference to morale. Besides these experienced troops, Charles also had levies of militia. These forces were, of course, less experienced in combat, but they played crucial roles in gathering supplies and harassing the Muslim forces, contributing to the overall military effort. They did their part. While traditional historical accounts often suggest that the Franks were significantly outnumbered, with estimates of a 2-to-1 ratio against them, the view is not universally accepted. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, for instance, offers a different perspective that challenges the notion of the Franks being so outnumbered, indicating that actual numbers may have indeed been more balanced than previously thought. Well, Martel's strategic foresight was certainly on full display, as he anticipated that Abd al-Rahman would feel compelled to engage in battle to reach Tours and potentially loot it Positioned on a hill and sheltered by trees, Charles' troops held the tactical advantage, diminishing the effectiveness of the Umayyad cavalry, which would be forced to charge uphill through obstructive terrain. Since the Battle of Toulouse, a decade earlier, Charles had been meticulously preparing for such a confrontation. Historian Edward Gibbon, among others, regarded Charles' situation as making the best of a difficult scenario. Despite being allegedly outnumbered and lacking heavy cavalry, Charles commanded a corps of tough, battle-hardened infantry who had immense faith in his leadership. And at a time when permanent armies were a rarity in Europe, Charles had even secured a significant loan from the Pope himself, convincing him of the dire emergency to train and maintain a well-equipped and professional fighting force. Thus, in a phalanx formation, Charles' infantry was ideally prepared to withstand the cavalry charges. His choice of high ground, supplemented by the natural barrier of trees, significantly bolstered their defensive capabilities. This setup, unknown to Arab forces due to intelligence failures, caught Abdul Rahman off guard regarding the quality and preparedness of the Frankish troops. Additionally, the environmental conditions played their own role. The Franks, you see, they were well equipped for the cold, dressed in attire suitable for harsh European winters, while the Arab forces, many of whom had probably never seen snow in their lives, wore lighter clothing, much better suited to the milder North African climate, putting them at a further disadvantage. The ensuing battle evolved into a strategic standoff, with the Muslims hesitant to assault what could potentially be a numerically superior enemy entrenched in a formidable defensive position. After all, who knows what could run out of those forests, and how many of them could be hiding? Well, Charles' forces, arrayed in their dense formations, patiently waited for the Umayyad charge. After a week of standoff, with winter looming, Abdul Rahman decided there could be no more delays, initiating the battle that would ultimately determine the fate of Europe. Abdul Rahman, of course, relied heavily on his cavalry, repeatedly charging the Frankish lines throughout the day. Despite several breaches by the Arab cavalry, the disciplined Frankish infantry held their ground. This successful defense against heavy cavalry was considered an extraordinary achievement at the time. The core of Charles' army, rallied up in that phalanx, had extensive campaign experience across Europe, which was crucial in withstanding the Umayyad charges. Each man in that phalanx did not stand next to a stranger, but someone who he had known for many, many years. Certainly helps when you're fighting beside a friend. Now, we do have one account which is rather detailed, a first-hand source from the year 754, the Mozarabic Chronicle. So I'll read from that now. While Abdul Rahman was pursuing Odo, he decided to despoil Tours by destroying its palaces and burning its churches. It was there he confronted the consul of Austrasia by the name of Charles, a man who, having proved himself to be a warrior from his youth, and an expert in things military, had been summoned by Odo. After each side had tormented the other with raids for almost 7 days, they finally prepared their battle lines and fought fiercely. The northern peoples remained as immobile as a wall, holding together like a glacier in the cold regions. In the blink of an eye, they annihilated the Arabs with the sword. The people of Austrasia, greater in a number of soldiers and formidably armed, killed the king Al Rahman when they found him, striking him on the chest. But suddenly, within the sight of countless tents of the Arabs, the Franks despicably sheathed their swords, postponing the fight until the next day, since the night had fallen during the battle. Rising from their own camp at dawn, the Europeans saw the tents and canopies of the Arabs all arranged just as they had appeared the day before. Not knowing that they were empty and thinking that inside them were Saracen forces ready for battle, they sent officers to reconnoitre and discovered that all the Ishmaelite troops had left. They had indeed fled silently by night in tight formation, returning to their own lands. That was from the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754. Now, there is another source of the time, another primary source, and it comes from the family of Charles Martel, actually, from their own chronicles. It reads thusly, from the continuations of Fredegar. Prince Charles boldly drew up his battle lines against them, and the warrior rushed in against them. With Christ's help, he overturned their tents and hastened to battle to grind them small in slaughter. The king Abdirama having been killed, he destroyed them. Driving forth the army, he fought and won. Thus did the victor triumph over his enemies. So, Al-Rahman did not immediately engage Charles Martel and was of course taken by surprise at Tours. Charles had strategically marched over the mountains, avoiding those old Roman roads, to surprise the Muslims, thus allowing him to choose the time and place for the battle. Certainly gives them an advantage. And, well, Abdul al-Rahman, while a competent general, he also made some crucial errors in the lead-up to the confrontation, mainly those involving hubris, a tale as old as time. He underestimated, or at worst disregarded, the possibility of Frankish intervention on behalf of their Aquitanian allies, and failed to accurately assess the strength of the Frankish forces. Additionally, he did not scout the movements of the Frankish army, which left him unprepared for their tactics and their numbers. It was these miscalculations that had several repercussions for the Muslim army. Firstly, they were encumbered already with significant amounts of booty, which hindered their mobility and impacted their effectiveness in battle. Secondly, they had already suffered casualties before the main engagement had begun. Furthermore, Al-Rahman chose not to bypass opponents like Odo, who could have been dealt with later, preferring instead to engage immediately with Martell, the principal power in Europe. This strategic choice contradicted some military theories which suggest avoiding leaving enemies behind However, the Mongols later demonstrated that bypassing weaker foes to focus on stronger ones can indeed lead to a more effective campaign. In this instance, the decision not to scout and bypass the lesser threats, however, led to a disastrous lack of preparation for the main battle against Charles. Well, Charles, he found himself in a position where he couldn't simply observe the Umayyad advancements without taking action. The destruction wrought by the Saracenic light cavalry across Gaul had both devastated the Aquitanians and ignited a fierce desire for retribution among his troops. Given the lack of a standing army and the fiercely independent spirit of his Frankish warriors, Charles faced significant challenges in controlling the timing and engagement of his forces. The situation demanded immediate action. The longer that the Franks had watched their territories being pillaged, the more difficult it became to maintain a cohesive fighting force, especially when the traditional campaigning season drew to a close. The stakes of inaction were, thus, exceedingly high. It suggested that if Charles had failed to confront and halt this Umayyad advance, there may have been no formidable force left to defend Western Europe. Thus, the significance of the Battle of Tours has been likened to other pivotal battles in history, such as Marathon and Leipzig, which profoundly influenced the course of Western civilization in their own way. The outcome of Tours, where Charles managed to halt this devastating invasion, was thus not just a tactical victory, but a turning point that preserved the trajectory of European development. While strategically, the decision to engage the Umayyads unexpectedly proved to be astute. By choosing the time and the place of the battle, he utilized this element of surprise to great effect, catching the Umayyads off guard and disrupting their momentum. It suggested that even Charles and his men might not have fully grasped the impact of their victory at the time, a battle that staved off the potential Islamic conquest of Gaul. After their defeat, the Umayyad army retreated south across the Pyrenees. In the years that followed, Martell continued his expansion southward. Following the death of Odo around 735, who had previously recognized Charles' authority, albeit reluctantly in 719, Charles aimed to annex Odo's duchy. He traveled there to secure the homage of the Aquitanians, but the local nobility declared Hunald, Odo's son, as their duke. Charles eventually recognized Hunald's legitimacy, particularly when the Umayyads allied with Duke Marontus of Provence the following year, posing a renewed threat. Hunald initially resisted acknowledging Charles as his overlord, but soon found himself with little choice but to submit, though this acknowledgement was brief, and Charles affirmed his reign over the duchy. In 735, the new governor of Al-Andalus, Al-Hajjaj, launched another invasion of Gaul. This invasion aimed to avenge the Umayyad defeat at Tours and further the spread of Islam. Historians note that Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj was particularly zealous, reportedly converting around 2,000 Christians during his military career. His forces thus advanced into French territory, crossing the Rhone River, capturing and looting Arles, and pushing deep into the heartland of Provence with the capture of Avignon, despite facing stiff resistance. But His forces maintained a presence in Septimania and parts of Provence for 4 years, conducting raids as far as Lyon, Burgundy, and Piedmont. Martell launched 2 campaigns of his own in 736 and 39 to reclaim Septimania, but they were both repelled, forcing him back to territories under his control. The second Umayyad expedition, despite its ultimate failure, was considered potentially more dangerous than the first. The cessation of serious Muslim expeditions across the Pyrenees followed, although smaller raids did continue. Plans for further large-scale invasions were disrupted by internal strife within the Umayyad lands, which often turned potential allies into adversaries. Despite their setback at the Battle of Tours, the Umayyads maintained control over parts of Septimania for another 27 years, though they were unable to push their frontiers further into Frankish territory. The stability of their rule in this region was partly due to treaties they had previously negotiated with the local populations. These agreements were strengthened in 734 under the governance of Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman Al Ghafiqi, the governor of Narbonne. He forged common defense pacts with several towns to protect against the advances of Charles Martel, who was methodically extending his control over the south. Martel's campaigns in this period were marked by significant victories. He managed to capture the Umayyad fortresses and decimate their garrisons during the siege of Avignon and the siege of Nimes. His military efforts culminated in the Battle of the River Bear, where the Umayyad forces, attempting to relieve Narbonne, were decisively defeated. Nonetheless, Charles faced a major challenge at the siege of Narbonne in 737. His attempts to capture the city failed, as the defenders, comprising both Muslim, Arab, and Berber troops alongside Christian Visigothic citizens, mounted a robust defense. Reluctant to commit his army to a protracted siege that could last years, and unwilling to sustain the heavy casualties of a full-scale frontal assault like the one at Arles, Martel chose instead to isolate the remaining Umayyad forces in Narbonne and Septimania. After the Umayyad defeat at Narbonne, the threat of invasion significantly diminished, and by 750, the unified caliphate itself had collapsed into civil war. The responsibility of finally bringing Narbonne into Frankish control fell to Charles' son, Pepin the Short, who achieved this goal in 759. This victory effectively expelled the Umayyad dynasty, pushing them back into Al-Andalus, where Abd al-Rahman founded an emirate in Cordoba, establishing it as a counterpoint to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Further to the northeast of Spain, the Frankish emperors established what became known as Marca Hispanica across the Pyrenees, in the region now part of Catalonia. They reconquered Girona in 785 and Barcelona in 801, establishing a strategic buffer zone against the Muslim territories. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to thank my top-tier patrons, Britt, Charles, Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, and Tim. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening all of this way for the history of the Battle of Tours. And what a battle it was. High stakes. Perhaps there's another Battle of Tours right around the corner. Good night, everyone. See you next time.